I'm going to try not to scold you all for taking a 25 rather than 15-minute break, but I do want to get going so that we have time for a discussion at the end. Our next speaker is Dennis Tan, who's the curator at the Castello del Buon Consiglio in Trento, in northern Italy. He's an expert on 18th century Venetian art. He was among the curatorial team that worked on the Frick's Palazzo Arquinto Tiepolo show a few years ago. And his exhibition, was it 2 years ago, I colori della Serenissima, about Venetian artists sending pictures to the Alto Adige, was eye-opening for me. And in my 2 trips to see it in Trent, we began talking about this conference and the exhibition. So it's a pleasure that Dennis is able to come and talk to us today about the chalk drawings of heads by Giambattista, Domenico, as well as Lorenzo, the other son in the family. Dennis.
Thank you, John, for your introduction and, of course, for your nice invitation. One of the most remarkable groups among Giambattista Tiepolo's chalk drawings, mostly red chalk drawings on blue paper, is that of drawings representing heads. It is an extraordinary series of faces characterized by a surprising vitality and richness of ideas. Most of these sheets come from the various albums that had been made within Tiepolo's workshop, housing drawings by both the father and his 2 sons, Domenico and Lorenzo. As is well known, George Knox is a scholar who, more than anyone else, dedicated attention to this material in his catalogue raisonné of Giambattista and Domenico's chalk drawings. He was able to reconstruct the working method of the Tiepolesque workshop, emphasizing the training of pupil through copying the drawings created by the teacher. However, his work, while undoubtedly representing a milestone for this field of investigation, on this aspect concerning heads in particular, seems susceptible to revision. Regarding these drawings, there are indeed still many questions that arise. Were they created as preparatory studies? Were they independent works of art? Were they just workshops exercises that were offered to pupils? Were they perhaps taken from other drawings that were kept in the artist's own studio? As you understand, these are pivotal questions and certainly not easy to solve. I would therefore like to try to pose the question by addressing the various head drawings in 3 major groups. In the first, the drawings made by Giambattista and Domenico as preparatory studies or primi pensieri, for the faces represented in very major works, paintings and altarpieces. A second group comprising exercises and copies, which I believe were made in the same workshop, mainly by his son Domenico. A third and final group with independent drawings, fantastic heads, or taken from life heads, testa naturale, according to the taste that developed in these years. As for the first group, preparatory studies of heads for paintings, examples would be numerous. An excellent example is that relating to one of the best drawings in Weimar. Preparatory for one of the kings in the adoration of the Alte Pinakothek in Munich altarpiece, a work already of artist maturity and executed for the Benedictine church in Schwarzach in 1753. The beauty of this sheet, which preserves all the richness of the chiaroscuro variations in the extreme synthesis of the chalk strokes, shows the level of Giambattista's drawing practice in the case of preparatory studies for paintings. The stroke is extremely mobile, synthetic, capable of capturing the chiaroscuro passages of the images with extreme efficacy. The touches of white chalk are limited to a few points of light. This sheet belongs to the so-called Bossi Bayern album, which is certainly the richest of the albums collected in the Tiepolo studio, with over 300 drawings of heads. The freshness of sheets of this kind justifies the attributive shifts of other drawings. For example, this drawing in the Museum of Fine Art of Budapest, representing the head of St. James, related to the painting preserved in the same museum, has to be assigned to Domenico, as recognized by Fenio and recently confirmed by Andrea Xere. Catherine Whistler correctly considered it as a preliminary drawing for the etching that Domenico drew from the painting. It seems to me that in the same way we should consider the head of the St. Anna in Copenhagen, believed to be preparatory for the Cividale altarpiece now in Dresden. It has recently been confirmed as a Giambattista preparatory drawing, but I think we should regard it as a work of his son, as already suggested in the past. I'll show you in comparison another drawing by Giambattista, part of the Berdeley album of the Hermitage, representing a head of an old woman made with great sensitivity. To my knowledge, this drawing does not correspond to any known commission. The comparison of the two sheets demonstrates very clearly what references we can expect between a preparatory drawing, inventive, creative, impulsive, I should say, which is imagined to confront a model from life, and a drawing made after a painting. I think, therefore, that these sheets belong to a second type of drawings from the Tiepolesque workshop, those that originated as copies from his father's major paintings. I would like also to show you a sequence that I believe to be significant for understanding the drawing practice of Tiepolo's workshop. The drawings connected to the face of extraordinary St. Agatha of the altarpiece for the parish church of Lendinara, now in the Gemäldegalerie in Berlin. This is one of the most emphatic and inspired phases in Giambattista's art, where it is evident how the master seeks to translate the saint's feelings and emotions into painting. In my interpretation, the sequence begins with a drawing at the Getty Museum in Los Angeles, which I believe the earliest idea for the project. This drawing undoubtedly preserves the breadth of a study taken from life. Here, Giambattista is really exploiting the red chalk technique to find the new expressive effects, a face represented in a precise moment, half in light and half in shadow, in the suspension of a wings, with eyes turned to the sky. Tiepolo explores this idea in a second study in Berlin, presenting the face this time in full light. This drawing appears closest to the final version, while retaining variations indicative of a study phase. Look, for example, at the marks that only hint at the saint's hair. Another drawing in Berlin, also belonging to the Bossi album, is anonymously considered by Giambattista. However, I must confess, given the reasoning I've just presented, I found it problematic. The first drawing is concise, executed with a few red and white chalk hatchings. The latter one is very meticulous and accurate, with a whole series of crossed web-like lines, while the head has been straightened. These elements place it at a significant distance even from a preparatory drawing by Giambattista, such as that for the Munich altarpiece, in comparison realized through minimal means. At present, all these drawings and others, with few variations, are believed to be by Giambattista. But can the same artist create drawings so different in just a few years? Yes, perhaps, but with different purposes. My theory, which I acknowledge remains problematic, is that the second Berlin sheet was made after the painting, at the Seine d'après. Although it is a drawing of excellent quality, it seems likely that this sheet was made rather within the workshop and not as a preparatory study. It could be, of course, a ricordo made by Giambattista for student exercise. But Domenico could also be the author. Unlike his father, he is in fact a draftsman I would call analytical in all his major drawings. We know, moreover, that he made an etching after this altarpiece with an extremely effective outcome. The idea of St. Agatha head naturally remains in Domenico's repertoire, and he reused it for the head of St. Lucy da Sette Fonti in the altarpiece for the Church of San Michele in Murano. A study preserved at the Albertina in Vienna illustrates the relationship more clearly. Even when Domenico studies independent compositions, his analytical temperament emerges clearly. In addition to the questions of attribution, the study drawings relating to the pathetic face of St. Agatha also prompt different reflections, marking an important moment in the European history of art. These drawings stand at the intersection between the search for a new representation of expressions, the so-called Poetica degli Affetti, provoked by the Venetian scholar and polygraph Francesco Algarotti, and the emergence of the Testi al Naturale, life drawings of heads conceived and collected as independent works of art and presentation drawings. Giambattista Piazzetta, an outstanding artist a few years older than Tiepolo, and in many ways his early model, played a pivotal role in this genre. However, the exchanges were not unidirectional. Some of Piazzetta's more mature ideas exhibit a new pathos, perhaps derived precisely from reflection on certain works by Tiepolo. This is revealed by comparison with a beautiful drawing by Piazzetta representing St. Stephen in Washington with those eyes turned to the sky and that half-closed mouth. On the other hand, there are cases where it's also the attribution of the paintings that misleads the judgment regarding the drawings. This head, preserved in Providence, has been correctly associated with the painting representing San Luigi Gonzaga in the Pinacoteca di Brera, commonly believed to be by Domenico. Since the quivering quality of the details and light passages, I agree with Knox that the painting should instead be considered a late masterpiece by Giambattista. Different from the scholar, however, I believe that it should be equally concluded that the drawing is by the same artist. Giambattista manages to suggest a real volume and texture of the face with just a few touches. In contrast, a drawing by Domenico in Fulda, preparatory for the stoning of St. Stephen, and now in Würzburg, tends to leave volumes much less defined. The third and final group I would like to focus on is that relating to drawings apparently unconnected with the major works of Tiepolo's art, and perhaps conceived as autonomous studies. The drawings preserved in Weimar are a particularly interesting group within this typology. The provenance of these drawings is again from the so-called Bossi Beirnen album, but their interest is heightened by the fact that they are in Weimar because they were acquired by Goethe when he was also serving as a conservator at the city's library. The Tiepolos not only made some paintings of fantastic heads depicting old men and Oriental philosophers, but they also elaborated drawings of heads in particularly lively and natural poses of wonder and astonishment, with characteristic of more sprightly narrative flair than the Piazzetta's examples. According to Knox, they are almost all by Giambattista, except for two by Lorenzo. When compared with a powerful early study by Giambattista in black chalk preserved in Berlin, this drawing of a head of an old man reveals the stylistic differences. While the father flaunts his quickness and immediacy of invention, the younger of the sons seeks careful and finished effects. According to Ursula Verena Fischer-Pace, Lorenzo's presence should be extended and recognized in, for example, the study after Alessandro Vittoria's bust of Jacopo Palmaggione, as moreover a comparison with Morgan's extraordinary drawing confirms. However, she suggests that Giambattista's contribution would still be preponderant. Nevertheless, most sheets appear incompatible with Giambattista's manner, as evident comparing this head of a woman from a private collection with one of similar pose that reveals a greater affinity with Lorenzo's creation. My proposal is that, with exceptions noted above, most of the Weimar heads should be attributed to Lorenzo, given the consistency on style. Although Lorenzo is not represented in the Morgan exhibition, one cannot help but ponder his role as a draftsman. Indeed, there is no doubt that he represents a sort of noise in the evaluation of this series of head drawings, and in this area we move by trial and error and view with a few certainties. The confusion around Lorenzo's oeuvre is evident in two albums. The first, preserved in Amsterdam and already believed to be by the youngest of the Tiepolos, has to be confirmed to a pupil of Giambattista, the painter Francesco Lorenzi. There are several sheets under Lorenzo's name that are actually referable to this Veronese pupil, such as the head of a woman that I show you on the right. The second group, attributed by Tim and Knox to Lorenzo, is represented by the so-called third Würzburg album, which reproduces some other Tiepolo sheets, mostly from the Gatteri album in Venice. However, there are inscriptions that also link it to the German pupil Georg Anton Urlaub, and nothing seems to conclusively link it to Lorenzo's manner. Therefore, one should make a backward track, starting from the sure sheets that are documented later in Lorenzo's career and are from his Spanish period. The sheets in the Prado are consistent with his pastels of these years, most recently exhibited in the show Majestad de Jornado at the Royal Palace in Madrid. These works reveal him as a draftsman of exceptional skills. In this context, attempting to distinguish hands by attributing only lower quality sheets to Lorenzo appears rather naive. The Spanish drawings are characterized by an extremely accurate drawing style, minute strokes, frequent use of white chalk for highlights. These are features that begin to glimpse in some of the Weimar drawings. George Knox attributed a sheet depicting a head of a boy and preserved in Weimar to Giambattista Tiepolo, while the drawing with the same composition preserved in Fulda was believed by Lorenzo. I propose that this idea should be reconsidered. While the Fulda drawing retains a certain air of improvisation and seems to be drawn from life, the Weimar drawing shares characteristics identified in the Spanish sheets. As far as we know, however, it is the only case of a head drawing among the Weimar sheets that can be directly linked to a father's idea. More complex are the cases of other drawings preserved in Weimar. They do not correspond to other ideas and have somewhat different characteristics to Domenico sheets. The eldest brother, in his studies of heads, appears less interested in the definition of volumes. It is not possible today to analyze these drawings one by one. However, the fixity of gazes, a certain rigidity of stroke, the luministic experiments with the play of shadows and lights created with the hands on the faces, which are not always convincing, may testify perhaps to the experiments of an artist looking for his own way. At times, the inspiration is certainly related to his father's poses. Here again, a comparison with the Getty drawing. The derivation is obvious, but everything seems translated into a more delicate and naive language. More dramatic subjects also appear, reminiscent of those found in Giambattista's paintings in the 1750s, for example, in the great pictorial poem of Villa Valmarana. In this sequence of faces can actually fit also a drawing in Berlin already claimed by Thiem, as well as another study from a private collection. We find here the idea of a hand in front of a face to conceal it. This pose in Algarotti's writings recalled illustrious exemplars of paintings of antiquity, but for Lorenzo it is primarily an opportunity for a virtuosic display of light and shade effects. When studying these materials in person, it's clear that some sheets were collected in a small sketchbook. They bear in the upper right-hand corner progressive numbers written in the same red chalk used for the heads. This is likely a sketchbook that ended up in the Bossi album and was dispersed with it. Some sheets are now in other museums, such as the drawing representing the head of a young man at the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, marked with the number 19. However, the numbering certainly goes up to 24, a number glimpsed in one of the Weimar drawings. I think we should consider mainly Lorenzo as an artist who is in the process of finding his way as a pastelist. These studies are exercises that in some cases may have originated as copies from his father's drawings, but anticipate the head's drawings, serving as independent works of art. Giambattista Piazzetta was undoubtedly a source of inspiration for these types of heads conceived as autonomous sheets. I'll give you one more example, a drawing representing a head of a man already attributed to Piazzetta. A closer look at the sheet reveals it as a step forward of Lorenzo, a carefully outlined drawing in which we see the pastelist at work. This is no longer a mere study sheet, but a larger drawing created for collecting, to be exhibited with frames and glasses, as commonly observed in Piazzetta's chalk drawings. In contrast to the proliferation of lines, we observe a more precise execution here, with careful shading effects. We can only recognize as a vestige of a youthful practice the flickering of some parallel or crossed strokes, contributing to an effective chiaroscuro articulation in the image. There are the same characteristics that we trace in another head already attributed to Lorenzo, and bearing the description of the so-called reliable, not so reliable in fact, Venetian hand, Giambattista Tiepolo. The Weimar drawings could be dated within the 1750s, the first decade of Lorenzo's activity. These drawings seem a connection between the Weimar and Spanish drawings, thus made in a later phase around the early 1760s. Allow me to conclude with a more general observation, accompanied with an image of a remarkable portrait of Lorenzo by Giambattista, just to seek your benevolence after these exhausting connoisseurship exercises. It's impossible not to notice the abundance and significance of these head studies within Tiepolo's workshop, both due to their creative process and the education of the pupils. Tiepolo is undoubtedly the painter of imagination, all spirit and fire, tutto spirito e fuoco. However, what sets his dreams on fire is always the spark of a real observation, study from life. And this is what makes his vision of hallucinations so credible and convincing. Thank you.
I wish that we had more such heads in our collection, perhaps for the next exhibition. We turn now to a talk by Reba Snyder, who is the Walter and Constance Burke paper conservator here at the Morgan. As we've mentioned, this is a project that began with research during the pandemic. And one of the silver linings of COVID was that it allowed us to slow down the exhibition schedule and have time to delve into the collection, as Ian and I have, but also to talk to our conservation center. And just as we were looking at 300 drawings for stylistic problems, so too Reba was looking at all of them as well for technical evidence, condition, types of inks, types of paper. And her talk today will tell us about some of the things she found. Thank you.
So as John mentioned, I've spent the better part of 2 years looking at the Tiepolo drawings in the Morgan's collection. As you've heard, the Morgan owns something over 300 works by the Tiepolo family, spanning nearly the entire 18th century, and so provides us with an extraordinary chance to see the range of their work. I'm going to take you a little bit deeper into the materials used by both Tiepolos, seen only in the Morgan collection. So there are some limitations to these drawings, but still lots to talk about. The Tiepolos were two of the most prolific Italian draftsmen of the 18th century. We'll be looking at the papers and the inks they used and interpreting something of the history of the drawings as seen in the physical evidence that's still visible today. So let's start by looking at paper. Assessing the characteristics of paper takes a little bit of close looking under varying light conditions. A lovely drawing seen in normal lighting can become a frightening landscape of distortions and disruptions when seen in raking light. I'll be showing you drawings seen in raking light, where the light skates across the surface from the side, transmitted light, in which light goes through the paper from behind, and transmitted infrared light, in which longer wavelengths of light penetrate the paper and the media to illustrate its structure. Many of these images were made with a multispectral imaging system purchased for the Conservation Department by our visiting committee. When we think of typical Tiepolo papers, at least for the ink drawings, we think of high-quality, bright white papers like the ones you see on the screen, both by Domenico and Giambattista. But there's more to it than that. All 18th century papers were made by processing rags into paper pulp, and the quality of the paper is affected by the quality of the rags and the processing. There we go. In this illustration from Lalande, you can see that the rags were sorted into bins by quality and were then washed. The cleanest, whitest rags became the cleanest, finest, whitest papers. Makes sense. Rags that were stained or discolored or dark became less fine, darker papers. Brown papers were made from coarser fabrics like hemp, canvas, or old ropes, and blue papers were made from blue-dyed cloth in the 18th century, and they were usually not made in the same mills as the white papers because they didn't want to contaminate the vats. We do see very fine quality papers used both by Giambattista and Domenico. The transmitted light image shows us that the paper pulp is evenly distributed across the sheets. The chain and laid lines made by the paper-making screen are crisp, and the surface of the paper is even and well-sized. It takes the media evenly. Here's another example, also seen in transmitted light, of a very fine quality paper. But now, having looked at hundreds of Tiepolo papers in the Morgan's collection, it's clear to me that most of the Morgan's drawings are not made on superfine quality papers, but on second quality or imperfect sheets. In raking light, you can see a few examples of creases in this paper. This made the paper second or second quality. These creases were made during the paper-making process, probably as the wet sheets were placed on felts and stacked under pressure. The creases are all present before the media is applied, so they're not damages to the drawing, just examples of flaws in the paper. These are most often seen at the corners or outer edges of sheets. Here you can see multiple examples of a very particular kind of creasing. These closely spaced wrinkles are made when damp papers are grouped into small batches called spurs and then hung over ropes in the drying loft near the end of the paper-making process. You can see that in this illustration, also from Lalande, that the spurs, these groups of paper, are placed on ropes high up in the air to dry, and then they're removed with a stick, as you can see on the right, providing another opportunity for small damages and creasing to occur. These groups of wrinkles are most prominent on the sheets directly in contact with the rope, and less intense or non-existent on the sheets on these outer layers. In addition to documenting the papermaking process, these wrinkles also tell us something about the size of the sheet. If the wrinkles are at the outer edges of the drawing, as is common as we saw in the prior slide, it tells us that the sheet was at least roughly twice as large as what you see, since the rope marks are always in the center of the original sheet. Knots and inclusion are common indicators of imperfect papers. Most of the Tiepolo papers at the Morgan contain knots. These are little clumps of unbeaten fibers or threads, a sign of a less well-beaten pulp. In many sheets, there are just a few knots sprinkled across a well-made sheet. At the upper left, you can see the impression of a curved bit of debris that left a real deep mark on the paper but has since been lost. This could have been a bit of rope or a string that was caught in the felts when processing the paper, and it clearly affects the quality of the sheet, but not the quality of the drawing. The Morgan has numerous examples of Tiepolo drawings with many small knots scattered throughout the entire sheet. These are not generally visible in normal light, but in transmitted and raking light, or transmitted infrared, as you see here, the knots are extremely visible. They make an uneven and slightly irregular surface texture, which is a little bit hard to describe. But papers with many small knots are very common in these drawings, especially in drawings made by Domenico in his later years, but they essentially appear throughout the entire career of both artists. Finally, we get to the worst quality papers, the coarse papers, cheaply produced and often used for wrapping. These contain many knots and inclusions of uncut fibers and debris because the pulp is poorly processed. And I think you can see in the circle some of these areas of sort of weaker, thinner pulp. These papers are made of mixed colored fibers. They're not pure linen, they're not cotton. They're almost always dark beige or brown. They can also be blue papers. In the case of both father and son, coarse papers are most often used for chalk drawings. This is understandable as the rougher surface holds onto the chalks as well as providing a mid-tone background. And as typical, and as you've just seen in the prior talk, both artists use combinations of black, red, and white chalks, very traditional. I personally have not seen any chalk drawings on very fine papers, but maybe Catherine has. This example of faded blue paper has many knots and a very uneven pulp distribution, making for some very thin, weak areas of the paper, and again, you can only see it in transmitted light. So what appears to be a beautiful drawing on a beautiful sheet of paper is actually something a little bit different. These flaws were clearly ignored by Domenico and Giambattista in making their drawings. This is another example of chalk drawings on blue paper. When seen in raking light, you see the extraordinary texture, and then on the right, through transmitted light, all of the lumps and bumps and undigested fibers that are present in the paper. Over the years that I've been at the Morgan, I've documented watermarks using beta radiography, a sort of X-ray form. There are an extraordinary number of watermarks in our Tiepolo collection. I've found so far over 170 watermarks on about 300 sheets, and more than 60 different watermarks. Most of them are now illustrated in Corsair, the Morgan's online research catalog. We can also see from this array of watermarks that many of the papers used were produced in Italy in the wider Veneto region. I have certainly not identified all of them, but I'm grateful for the work of Silvia Puglisi, who is actively studying archives of the paper mills in the Veneto and Lake Garda area, and whose work has helped me to identify some of these. The frequently seen triple crescent marks, or the tre lune at the lower right, and the crescent moon with a profile at the lower left, are an indication of the size of an Italian sheet, rather than any specific mill. And both papers appear with great frequency in 18th century Italian papers, and of course in our Tiepolo collection. These are more examples of the German watermarks that Ian discussed a little while ago. And again, we have lots of examples of these. These happen to be some of the actually finest quality papers in our collection. They have virtually no knots. They have a very even distribution of pulp, clear chain and laid lines. And clearly, this collection of watermarks will provide all of you with some fodder for research in the future. I've also found evidence that many of the white papers used by Domenico in his later years contain a sprinkling of blue fibers. This is a technique used by paper makers to visually counteract the natural yellowness of the pulp, making the paper seem whiter. We tend to think of white papers as being very simple, very beautiful, and they are, but they're a little bit more complex than you might expect. The surface texture of paper is something that conservators study. We're interested in how the media interacts with the paper. How does the ink or chalk sit on the surface? How is the chalk or charcoal absorbed into the texture? Will we change the surface in some way by doing a treatment? We can see that the artists, both Tiepolos, use both the felt side and the wire side of the paper for their drawings. The felt side that you see at the left is smoother, reflecting its pressing against wool felts, while the wire or screen side shows the pattern of the thick and thin wires on the paper-making mold, making chain and laid lines. On different sheets, the chain lines, identified by the arrows, run in both directions, meaning that it was unimportant to the artist, who was most likely interested in positioning the sheet for compositional purpose without thought as to the surface or the direction of the chain lines. Here in Raking Light, you can see a few examples of different surface textures seen in this collection. Some are quite smooth and even, and one at lower left has very strong laid lines, creating a slightly ridged texture. At the lower right, the paper is moderately coarse, not quite as dark or as rough as the chalk papers, but similar. What has become clear to me is that except for choosing the roughest surface papers for the chalk drawings, neither Tiepolo specifically chose a paper for its surface qualities. Neither made a consistent effort to use only one side of the paper over the other, either wire or felt side. We see both used throughout. And all of these examples are also a testament to the wide range and subtle variations of paper available in Italy in the 18th century, and also to the apparently endless supply of different papers in the Tiepolo studio. Clearly, both artists use a wide range of paper, and just as clearly, were not interested in purchasing the finest quality of papers. Given the number of drawings produced by each artist over very long working careers, it makes economic sense, and it really takes nothing away from our appreciation of these drawings. Now I want to focus for a few minutes on the primary media used by the Tiepolos, ink. As you can see from this montage, there are a wide variety of ink colors seen in the Morgan's drawing, and all but one, an anomaly in blue wash, show us a tremendous range of brown and black tones. There are yellow browns, red browns, pink browns, neutral browns, muddy dark browns. There are also black browns and light grays and deep blacks. Based primarily on infrared light examination, in which iron gall ink becomes transparent, I believe that nearly all of the brown inks are iron gall ink, with a large percentage of them being mixtures of iron gall ink with carbon black. Carbon black and iron gall were the two most commonly used inks from the Middle Ages through to the 19th century. In the 18th century, most iron gall ink was made in the studio, but by late in the century, some commercially made inks were available in shops. Formulations and quality of inks varied wildly, and this can help explain the wide range of brown colors we see in these drawings. Different solutions could affect the color of the ink. For instance, wine, beer, and vinegar are mentioned in ink recipes. Other additives like logwood dye, indigo, or carbon black were often added to increase body or density in the freshly made ink. In the studio, it would be common to have both thick and thin inks available. One batch for use with lines, and into which you would dip a quill pen, and brushes into another for wash. As the ink mixtures aged, particles settled out and were caught up by the brush and used in washes, as we'll see shortly. I actually find it fascinating and frustrating to describe the many colors of brown ink in these drawings, and I caution that photography of these works often shifts the color balance in a variety of different ways, and you really cannot be sure of the true color of the ink without seeing the original. And even with the quality of digital imaging that we have today, you just can't trust it. You have to go to the original. So starting here with a simple line drawing by Giambattista using just a quill and dark brown ink, and another drawing by Domenico using simply brush. There are no underdrawings in these works. These are probably two of the simplest drawings that we'll see today. A technique shared by father and son was the use of pen. This is an example of an ink drawing made over black chalk. This was common for both artists, and while I don't have time today to discuss this, I couldn't resist showing you the drawing in infrared light. The infrared light makes the iron gall inks appear transparent. It essentially vanishes and enables us to see the chalk drawing very clearly. I think we could do a whole other class on just these underdrawings. A technique shared by father and son was also the use of a pen followed with a very wet wash very quickly so that the ink lines are blurred or even partly erased as they're dragged into the wash. This is a clear indication of the speed with which the drawings were made. Domenico seems to use more controlled and carefully applied washes as he develops his own style in later years, but the speed and the application of wash is something that you've already seen in innumerable drawings already today. And once again, I have to note that all of these ink drawings use the white reserve of the paper for highlights. There is no white chalk, no white wash or watercolor or pastel anywhere on our ink drawings. It's really an extraordinary understanding of the sort of spatial thinking of these artists that they could do that. Further evidence that one ink was used for the pen and another for the brush can be seen in this work, which now appears as brown wash over black ink lines. And here, where the gray wash is applied over brown pen lines. At the moment of application, these would have appeared as overall black and gray ink and wash drawings. The iron gall ink that is now brown was initially gray or black, and over time it oxidizes and changes color. This color change was understood by artists as it could happen very quickly, sometimes in days, more often in weeks or months. And it suggests to me that for the Tiepolos, the ink color was irrelevant. It was the application and the act of drawing that was important. As I think you can see on the left, the gray wash used by Domenico has many small black particles in it, which settle into patterns in the paper as the wash dried. This suggests either a poorly prepared ink or an older ink that had been sitting around the studio for some days or weeks, allowing the particles to settle out, but they're captured by the brush. And here we see an example of a thicker than usual, slightly muddy brown ink, which really enables us to see the strokes of the brush and the way that the ink moves onto the paper. You can see that the ink covers some of the dried pen lines. It has a kind of muddy quality that is not typical of Tiepolo works, but is seen occasionally. As Ian already noted, these tiny works must have been made on the same day with the same ink on a single sheet of paper and was later cut up into fragments. Since these have been photographed, I have actually rejoined the two little fragments at the bottom. So the umbrella is now whole. Here are two examples of drawings made with black ink and wash, probably a pure carbon ink. We see this less often than brown-black mixtures, but its use does seem to relate to groups of drawings like the Angelico and Medoro series and some of the Punchinellos. I think that further research may show us if this represents a particular time or place of production, or if it's a random use of studio materials. As Domenico matures, we start to see more complex drawings done in ink mixtures. Here, we see a series of washes carefully applied over dried black-brown ink, closely following the underdrawing. This is a slower process with more precise and finished work. It shows us the layering of wet washes with different densities over one another, and it shows us more ink lines over the dried wash and the initial ink lines. It's a very complicated layering structure that gets even more complicated, as we'll see in a minute. In this same work, Domenico makes a later correction on the scroll using pure iron gall ink, which vanishes, as you see at the right, under iron gall ink. It's a strange attention to detail, and it might be a little bit another one of one of these little jokes. My Italian is not good enough to explain that to you. There we go, sorry. In his late series of biblical scenes, Domenico works in a much more complex but well-planned series of layers. Each of these works begins with a strong underdrawing in charcoal. The heavily applied charcoal is not brushed away to make a faint underdrawing, but Domenico leaves a substantial amount of media on the paper. This loose charcoal becomes mixed with the washes, seen here in the background. I think that you can see the particles of black charcoal and the fact that the particles have been absorbed by the knots in the paper. And you can really see that in our transmitted light image, where these knots in the paper would have held onto the water of the wash and dried more slowly, creating a kind of speckled background. And it's a wonderful example of how the paper texture and what we might consider flaws in the paper lead to unintended artistic effects. The detail in infrared really shows the knots as dark spots, and you can really only see the darkest washes present because, again, the iron gall ink has, if you will, vanished under infrared light. After the underdrawings, sometimes a thin background wash is laid in, carefully avoiding the highlight areas. Then pen and ink lines are applied, loosely following the charcoal design, but often small compositional changes are made. In these late drawings, there are absolutely wonderful underdrawings in charcoal where you can really see the shift in the compositions. I just don't have time to show them to you today. I'm just going to show you some details of these late works by Domenico, which are just showing you the varying layers of brown and black wash. This is really, really fascinating to me because when this drawing was initially made, it would have been a whole series of gray washes, and therefore even more difficult to understand, and in a certain way, the fact that the iron gall ink, the brown ink, has oxidized and changed in color gives us an opportunity to better understand the layer structure of these works. In my experience with the Morgan drawings, both artists use color in a very limited way. The Morgan owns only one work drawn in blue wash, and there are only two others, seen here, where Giambattista and Domenico add color to an ink drawing. Color seems to have been reserved for their paintings. Finally, I want to wrap up by showing you how some of these works have suffered as a result of time, poor handling, or overenthusiastic restoration. I've examined hundreds of these works under ultraviolet and transmitted light, which enables us to see old damages and repairs that are not visible in regular lighting. When the drawings were removed from the original studio albums, as has happened to nearly all Tiepolo works, many were torn out, leading to damages in the corners. These were often trimmed away on the diagonal to neaten the edges. These sheets were initially rectangles of one size or another, not octagons or hexagons. At left, you can see that an example of cut corners and of the thinned areas of paper where the adhesive was pulled off and left behind in the album. At the lower right, you can see that there are slightly rounded corners that have been filled with another paper, beveled at the edges, essentially to square off the paper. This was another solution to torn corners because, for some reason, people really like to see a complete sheet of paper. Here, in the cockling and creasing at the outer edges or corners, you can see that many of the drawings were once restrained in albums or other mounts. Even when released, evidence of their stress is visible in raking light. The stress was caused by the adhesive holding the paper in place while the rest of the sheet moved with changes in humidity. Many old master drawings are stained, and many Tiepolo works, while somewhat protected by their placement in albums, also stayed in the studio for years and were exposed to, let's call them accidents of human touch. Perhaps, please note the small circles, which seem to be perfectly clean here, but when seen in ultraviolet light, we see stains that are invisible in normal lighting. This is an indication of past restoration treatment. I believe that many of the drawings mounted in our Heinemann albums, acquired in 1996, were restored before they were mounted in the 1950s. In some cases, strong bleaches must have been used to eliminate these stains. The bleach also lightened the inks, in some cases diminishing the contrast of brown against white and losing delicate highlights of the palest washes that we see in other works. These kinds of aggressive bleaching treatments are no longer done by paper conservators, but at the time, 60 or 70 years ago, The desire for a clean, white sheet of paper was paramount, and the nature of deterioration by bleaching was not well understood. Another, also particular to Domenico drawings done on this moderately thick and slightly bumpy, lumpy paper, is severe foxing. This is caused by tiny iron impurities in the paper, which oxidize and rust over time. In fact, under magnification, you can actually see some of the tiny bits of iron. We can only speculate about the exact source of this iron, but it's possible that some paper pulp was contaminated by iron bits from the beating process, which used iron teeth to macerate the linen rags. It's also been proposed that it's possible that the water used to make the pulp was contaminated with specks of iron at certain points. There's also one very particular kind of deterioration of ink seen only in late Domenico drawings. Under magnification, you can see these fantastic crystallized forms of iron sulfate crystals. I have seen this only rarely on other Old Master drawings, yet it's surprisingly common in these works by Domenico. At first glance, the inks may have a kind of grayish metallic look and almost read as highlights. In other places, it has a salmon pink color, particularly at the upper right. This particular form of ink deterioration may almost be seen as a mark of authenticity for Domenico. It may be the result of the conditions under which these works were stored in the past, or simply an unstable ink formulation, or probably, more likely, both. When time permits, I may ask my conservation scientist colleagues for some help getting to the bottom of this. It's really been fascinating for me to have had the opportunity to examine and document the Morgan's collection of Tiepolos. I recognize that as a conservator, I have a very particular point of view and area of interest. My focus on the making of the drawing papers and the application of media is a bit different than the other talks today, but I hope that it's informed your appreciation and understanding of the Morgan's drawings, but also given you a broader understanding of 18th century drawing papers. Perhaps it will suggest some areas for further art historical research, and maybe it can relate to other drawings in other collections. My thanks to you all for your attention. Special thanks to my colleagues in the Morgan in conservation, drawings, photo services, and public programs.
Thank you, Reba. There is, as you can all imagine, a catalog to be written that somehow combines the information from the technical study with the art historical knowledge that we continue to gain on these drawings. I hope it's not bad form to have reserved the last word for myself as curator of the show. But I think it's actually really interesting to have a symposium like this at the end of the show rather than right at the beginning, because it gives us a chance to talk about some of the revelations that come only after the works are on the wall and after we, as curators, have been through the show again and again with colleagues, with tours, and just on our own. Now, apologies to those of you who have heard this from me before on one of those tours through the show or in the study day this morning, but I think it bears explaining to those who have not heard this, that the exhibition began as a research project into our deep holdings of Tiepolo drawings. The result of which was that rather than starting with the fanciest and most famous drawings, the greatest hits, the best known works, we, Ian Hicks and I, thought about looking at the mass of Tiepolo drawings at the Morgan to see what they might collectively tell us and what we might find. Very much in the same pattern that Reba has just shown, looking at everything and trying to look for patterns. So we didn't want just to repeat those drawings and those ideas that featured in previous exhibitions, but rather to think about process and also to consider what some of the scrappier drawings, those that didn't have obvious connections to the grand projects, might be able to tell us. You've already heard about some of Ian's most spectacular discoveries, but at least for me, one of the other revelatory aspects of our work, less obviously novel than these discoveries, has to do with the interactions of Giambattista and Domenico. We chose to focus on both of those artists in the exhibition, in part because doing so got us further into those questions of how all the different ways that drawings were used in the workshop. This also meant that we looked at and have exhibited not only Domenico's most easily recognizable late works, but also some of the juvenilia. Apologies that we did not include Lorenzo as well. We only have 3 drawings by him, and they were just too much of a tangent from everything else. Now, it's well known, and we've seen many times this afternoon, that Domenico borrowed ideas and motifs from his father. He did so often enough that scholars have been at times somewhat dismissive of him as an artist, someone technically brilliant, but maybe a bit too glib for his own good, quick to adapt, an easy solution from his father. Yet, I think that there's more to those borrowings than is perhaps always realized, and I'd like to look at this today. But let's start, though, with the beginnings, with the lessons learned in the studio, a familiar story in which a master teaches by example. This section of the exhibition starts with this juxtaposition. Giambattista's study after the Vittoria bust of Palma Giovane, and an early chalk drawing by Domenico, showing how clearly he learned his drawing style from his father, but that he was a different artist. We've seen this in Dennis's talk as well, tending to a more open form, a tendency to flatten planes, less attention to volume, less spontaneity in many ways than his father's drawing. We could also have started with something different. This juxtaposition of 2 studies after the Palma head. Now, the drawing on the right has always been called Giambattista in the past, but I think once you see the difference between father and son, as we've had many examples, it now looks far more like the work of Domenico. Now, this seemed maybe a bit too much of a specialist's game to play out in the context of an exhibition, although fascinating to look at in our study room or in a situation such as this. Because if you were really constructing this argument in the exhibition, you'd want to borrow more drawings, such as this drawing at lower left, usually attributed to Domenico from the British Museum, and this sheet at lower right by Lorenzo, probably one of the works from Weimar that Dennis has already shown us. I'm digressing a bit, though, because while this is an interesting workshop practice, one that famously goes back to the Tintoretto studio of copying after sculpture, neither the exhibition nor my talk today is really primarily about questions of attribution. Instead, going back to that wall of the exhibition, we also see works like this one, now at upper left. And in the label, I note that it's one of Domenico's many studies in the mode of his father's, figure seen from below. And I even, on the label, illustrate what's now at center, a sheet in Princeton, which includes a copy after one of the Giambattista figures that's there in the show. Now, Domenico's drawing, the one at upper left, interests me not so much for how it is like Giambattista, but rather how unlike his drawings it is. So too, the adjacent work. I love this sheet. Combining, in a way, one of Domenico's figure vestiti with one of the exoticizing heads. And in addition to these 2 examples, if we were looking at works in other collections, you could include these. We've already seen the sheets at lower right from the National Gallery of Art, and at center from the Courtauld, and I'll add one from Princeton at lower left. These amazing early drawings by Domenico drawn entirely with the brush, no pen at all used there. Now, at the beginning of the exhibition, I make the point that Giambattista took almost a decade or more until he settled into what we today, with historical perspective, recognize as his characteristic style. Catherine made this even more clear in her talk earlier this afternoon. And Giambattista seems to have encouraged Domenico to do the same, to experiment in many different modes. But now, returning to the revelations that come out of an exhibition, I think the point that Ian and I initially wanted to make in selecting these was that Domenico took such different approaches to the model of his father. But then once the exhibition was actually on the wall, I found myself looking at these painterly brush drawings that Domenico made in the late 40s and around 1750, and I noticed something else, that Giambattista seems to respond to Domenico's experiments. Here, for example, are Giambattista drawings from the mid-1740s with a beautiful use of wash that tends to be very controlled. But then, look at those studies made a few years later in connection with the Würzburg frescoes. We see a more painterly approach with wash that's almost sloppy in comparison to the early sheets. And while I guess this could be a natural progression of Giambattista alone, in the aftermath of the exhibition, I've now really come to see it as the interaction of father and son, with Giambattista responding to the new kinds of drawings that Domenico developed in the later 1740s. Indeed, this shift in Giambattista's style caused trouble for the great Tiepolo scholar George Knox. He insisted on dating Palazzo Labbia to 1744, contrary to all the other evidence that points to 1746 or 47, specifically because Knox could not understand how the brushy, wet drawings like these, or more to the point, those which he associated with the Scalzi and thus placed in 1743 to 45, Knox couldn't understand how those could possibly precede the much cleaner Labbia studies. So he predated Labbia so that those drawings would precede this set, all in the very narrow years of 43, 44, 45, 46. If instead these drawings are from the 1750s and are associated with the Church of the Pietà, we begin to get a much more logical progression of experimentation of both Domenico and Giambattista in the late 40s and into the early 1750s, with this increasing freeness and a tendency now to use wash not only more freely, but over pen lines that are still wet, something I don't think we see in any drawings before this set. This is one form of what I'm calling an artistic dialogue between Giambattista and Domenico, but there are other sorts of interactions that take place through their drawings. The body of chalk drawings presents a different sort of story. There are scores of drawings in which Domenico seems to have been tasked with copying his father's latest works, such as in these two sheets, the Morgans at lower left, and a related drawing in Stuttgart, both ultimately from the Bossi-Beierland collection. They record the splendid Death of Hyacinth that Giambattista painted while in Würzburg, now in the Thyssen in Madrid. Now, perhaps the idea was to document work that was going to be left behind in Germany. But then, even back home in Venice, that practice continued, such as in this sheet, copied from the musicians prominently featured at the base of Vivaldi's Church of the Pietà. You see a detail of the oil sketch at center, and then the finished work at bottom. And I think it's perfectly clear that this has to be copied after the final work. You can see above the theorbo, possibly invisible in the slide, the beginning of the curve of the globe, but even more telling, this disembodied horn on the top of the harp, absent in the oil sketch, there in the final work, but no preparatory drawing would include only half of a harp in such detail. They have to be copies after the finished work. And there are many, many, possibly hundreds of such copies. There's a notably large body of them in Stuttgart, for example. They're Domenico's records of the finished works, rather than Giambattista's studies for them. So I ask, what was the point of all of it? Just to record everything? Was that really necessary? And it's almost easy to imagine that Domenico would have resented this task, copying everything as it left the workshop, except there are so many cases where the copy was put to clever, if entirely unnecessary use, that there was something more going on. Take this drawing of a fallen warrior, one of my favorite works in the show. It's in Domenico's typical style of the early 1750s. Here, though, Domenico copies not one of his father's brand new works, but rather the Ca' Dolfin paintings done a quarter century earlier in 1726 or 27, the year in which Domenico was born. It too must be a copy after the finished work. You can see, for example, how the drapery at the man's right hip stops where it goes behind the rock of the final painting. Now, at one point, this drawing so confused George Knox that he proposed redating the Met siege of Carthage to the 1750s, assuming that Domenico was only making copies of works as they left the workshop. But the painting is surely from the 1720s, which begs the question of why Domenico went back and made a drawing of a work that had been around for years. And I think the answer is that it's because he was about to head off to Brescia, where one of his tasks was to depict the siege of Brescia. And there, in the foreground, he sticks the fallen warrior from the siege of Carthage. Now, this was a quotation that surely meant nothing to any living soul in Brescia other than Domenico himself, and which probably went completely unnoted at the time. But I can't see this as somehow representing an impoverishment of imagination. On the contrary, it feels like a game, a self-conscious doubling of meaning, at least for the artist himself, through such a quotation. It should come as no surprise then, or it's in this context, that we see Domenico, while in Brescia, go just up the road to Verona Nuova to make this drawing, also in the exhibition, a copy from one of the massive canvases his father had painted more than a decade earlier. And this drawing, too, was perhaps a kind of game between father and son, for in it, we see Domenico cleverly shifting things, using the bright white reserves of the paper to cast the shadowy figure of Moses there in the background in an entirely new light. I imagine him returning home to Venice and presenting it to his father with a sort of smile. Now, traditionally, this sort of copy drawing has been used to highlight the differences between father and son. To quote one review of the 1996 drawings exhibition, quote, "Our understanding of these drawings directly affects our view of the artistic personalities of Giambattista and Domenico. Decisive and original in the first case, compulsively appropriative in the latter." Now, I like the turn of phrase, Keith, compulsively appropriative, but I'm not sure that it needs to be contrasted with imagination and inspiration. I increasingly think that Domenico was, in fact, picking up on a studio practice that had also been Giambattista's. For example, consider all of his very finished compositional drawings, such as these 3 Annunciations. These are not drawings that are made in preparation for painting, nor to be sold or given away as gifts. They are simply for the artist's purposes alone. They're simply experiments in playing with a motif. But it doesn't mean that Giambattista, for all of his inventiveness, was beyond a bit of meaningful quotation. For as has been noted long before, the drawing at left takes that unusual pose of the Virgin, seemingly to shield herself from the angel using her mantle, from Solimena's altarpiece, sent by the great Neapolitan to San Rocco in Venice in 1733. And not just once, but several times we find this motif returning again. Here's a kind of reprise in a drawing done at least 2 decades later in this great lively Annunciation from the 1750s, also from the Cheney Algarotti album. Now, moreover, it's in this context of these quotations and many more like it that we need to understand this drawing. Done another 3 or 4 decades later by Domenico as part of his biblical series. This is a drawing that I actually added to the exhibition during the run of the show, substituting for one of the other biblical drawings because I liked its resonance with these earlier works and with the Carpenter Shop in the Punchinello series. It just, when we were done installing, I felt like this was the mistake I'd made in leaving it out. So now it's there in the show. Domenico's biblical series was itself just an extended sort of act of imagination, stretching the narrative over more than 300 drawings, incorporating all manner of source material. In this case, he bases the scene on a story from the apocryphal Gospel of James, which recounts that it was only after Joseph returned from a trip that the Virgin revealed her pregnancy to him. So here is Joseph's hat and cape, and he's just put down his staff, and the Virgin breaks the news to him. His reaction is a natural one in this situation. But her strange pose makes so much more sense only when we understand where it is coming from and those earlier depictions of the Annunciation. Again, this is really only for Domenico himself. Very few others could ever have recognized the quotation. And remember, all of the late great series, the Contemporary Life, the Biblical, the Punchinello drawings, never really left the workshop and seem to have been made for Domenico's enjoyment alone. And they're chock full of quotations, not only from his father, but even from his own works. As, for example, his Quack Dentist at upper left is a remembrance of a sort of a painting he made 35 years before, commissioned by Francesco Algarotti in 1754, just as the Dancing Dogs is a reprisal of a work he painted in Spain in the 1760s and left behind there. Domenico enjoyed the splendid leisure of a very rich man. His father started with nothing, but left behind an estate worth 60,000 ducats, and Giambattista at his death owned no fewer than 51 properties in and around Venice. This seems to have allowed Domenico in the last 15 or so years of his life to take no commissions, to paint only the family villa and the two most local churches, but to spend untold time, days, weeks, years, making all of those great late series drawings in this very complex technique that Reba has outlined. It's as though he just dedicated himself to what had been the family game all along, this process of invention and reinvention and play that drawing represented in that workshop. And he would make use of those record drawings in the most amusing ways. Turning, for example, the dead hyacinth from Würzburg, recorded in those earlier drawings, into a fresco on the walls of his home, combining them with one of Giambattista's own comic drawings, and showing a Punchinello who is perhaps more likely incapacitated by wine or a surfeit of gnocchi than by the shuttlecock, unlike the tennis ball that killed Hyacinth. And finally, it's especially the great Punchinello series that became a kind of artistic will and testament for Domenico, for Giambattista, and perhaps for Venetian art as a whole. It gave Domenico a chance to look back over decades or even perhaps centuries of invention. Sometimes he does so lightheartedly, with further racket games or other leisure pursuits like our familiar Dancing Dogs in this sheet lower right from Harvard. There are reprisals of Domenico's own works, but he also incorporates in the Punchinello series those of his father, such as this remembrance of Giambattista's Triumph of Flora, another work commissioned by Francesco Algarotti and sent off to Dresden way back in 1744. And then, as the series comes to an end, we find references to a much longer history. And in The Burial of Punchinello, I think we have a sly homage to Tintoretto's great paintings of St. Mark, with the Tiepolo clown now become the very patron saint of Venice himself, but also bringing us back to where we started, with Giambattista being commissioned to draw copies after Tintoretto's frescoes at the beginning of his career. I hope in digging into this give and take between Giambattista and Domenico, looking to this broad range of their works, we find that this spirited, inventive, and playful world of their drawings only makes these two brilliant artists seem all the richer, all the more worthy of further study and appreciation. At the lecture I gave at the opening of this exhibition, I admitted that I really didn't want to do yet another Tiepolo show here at the Morgan. I even showed this typescript of a lecture that Janos Schultz gave at the Frick way back in 1973. It starts, "I can hear some of your sighing. No, not Tiepolo again." Because I, in 2020, like Schultz in 1973, felt that Tiepolo had, quote, been turned upside down, inside out, bisected, dismembered, scrutinized, and then nicely put back together again. And yet, now, nearly at the close of the exhibition, I find that I have even more to say than I did when we began. And I feel as though we're still learning from these drawings anew every time I go through the show. And I actually await further chances to delve into the drawings by these two brilliant artists. Thank you. I'm now going to ask that we turn the house lights up and that our speakers come join me on the stage. I'm going to start not with the most obvious question, although we'll get there, but rather I'm going to ask our speakers. We've looked a lot at what makes Giambattista and Domenico distinctive as draftsmen, but how are they different from other draftsmen of their time? Are there things that they in their workshop do that really depart from Venetian tradition or 18th century tradition?
Catherine should speak since she's written.
Yeah,
she's written a book
on Venice and drawing, indeed. It was really aimed. It was. I'll admit it was aimed your way, Catherine. Yeah.
Yeah, but my book was really making the point about continuity.
I know.
Actually, because it's often been the 18th century has often been seen as a time when suddenly drawing began to flourish in Venice, as it hadn't done in the previous century, and so my book was basically trying to redress the balance of that. I think it's a really interesting question.
Can you hold the microphone up?
Yeah, no, I think it is a really interesting. I mean, in many ways, there's a huge, as I say, continuity. So many of the practices, of the ways of training, formation of the artists is very, very similar. And I drew parallels between the Tintoretto studio and the Tiepolo studio, indeed, in so many ways. But at the same time, there's, I think, what we find with both Tiepolos, maybe one thing that is a little bit broader is perhaps their interest in print culture, in each case in different ways. I was talking about Tiepolo and sort of entrepreneurship and drawings relating to prints from quite early in his career as a way of getting his style out there, but also clearly making his reputation, making money. And Domenico is very, very interesting in the way that he uses prints at a time when his father moves into etching for the sake of imaginative exploration. Domenico is doing both. So I suppose maybe for me that's one thing that's very innovative and different about the Tiepolo studio.
Is the
whole
use of
way that they use etching and printmaking.
Right. I mean, and we barely have, we have open to one page one of Domenico's Flight into Egypt etchings in the exhibition.
I mean they always start, they start I mean, Fontebasso starts making etchings as a result, so to speak, and other artists take that up, yeah.
So next, I have a question for Ian, who, as I've said many times, was there from the very birth of this project, but who literally did not lay eyes on the exhibition until 8:30 this morning. So, and while I don't mean to put you on the spot, what surprised you, having, we'd looked at all of these drawings before, many times, but seeing it on the walls of the exhibition, is there something that struck you? I mean, this could be applied to, a question for Dennis as well, who just saw the show today. But Ian, I'll start with you.
It's a good question. I'm hoping to go back through on my own again a few times this week. Certainly the Clerici grouping, and you discussed this morning, the difference between the drawings made before the oil sketch and those made after, and the differences in material and approach. I mean, it is, I know we looked at them all together as a group, but never
and Bill
divided
talked
that
about
way.
them all. But it was really only when the exhibition went on the wall that we realized that the drawings made before the Modello are in a more golden ink, and those that seem to be done in Milan as he adapts the Modello to the completely different format of the actual ceiling have a browner ink.
Yeah, the visual contrast is
exactly
kind of, which strikes you when you see it. Yeah.
Right, and there's another place for further research, because you would have to bring all of them together in order to make this comparison. The photographs simply don't represent the color of the ink. They all look the same color in the photographs. Bill?
Yeah, so I would say exactly what Ian said and that you said this morning, that I think I noticed when I wrote the Clerici little book, that certain things had to be done in Milan.
Yes.
But I certainly never concluded
that
and
I
the drawings
remember we
were different
talked about
technically.
different colors.
Yeah, I never noticed that. And I think the fact that you had the advantage or the luxury to have so many of these drawings open at once, immediately something pops to mind, whereas so I was looking at a lot of these things first on site, but then obviously comparing them at home.
Right. Yeah. One of the other things that we're doing at the end of the exhibition, which will maybe delight a few people as much as it delights me, is putting all of the drawings for any one project in the same set of boxes. So the Clerici group was scattered in 3 or 4 different boxes in 2 different size mats. The same with the Scalzi or Pietà group. They were not all kept together. All of the heads were in different boxes. The things wound up being added to boxes as they came in over time. Now we're hoping, we are planning at the end of the exhibition, as everything comes down, to reorganize so that you can look at things all for one project, or in as much as we're able to do a chronological ordering of the boxes, which we hope will lead to further revelations as scholars work through those boxes. I see Ketty has a question.
Yes, thank you. Actually, 2 questions, if I may. Both about Giovanni and Domenico Tiepolo drawing. One for Rima. When you showed at the end some of the corruption, for lack of a better word, of the ink, was there any evidence of maybe some gamma Arabic being added over it? And then the second question.
So wait, can I just repeat that back? Because I'm not sure everyone could hear you. So the question is, with that weird texture of the ink in Domenico, is there gum arabic added to the ink? Is that, yeah.
Yeah. And then the second question was, you mentioned this morning, or actually you showed for a couple of the drawings of the later series, where, for example, there's a painting by Loghi of the same sort of subjects. And I was wondering, you mentioned earlier, Giovanni Domenico at the end makes all these wonderful series for himself. He didn't need to work very much, and he just enjoyed, but therefore he must have also shared them, I guess, with friends.
Right.
Is there any evidence, beyond those sort of 2 cases you mentioned this morning, whereas there are other artists picking up from?
Right. So the late drawings are kept together. They descend intact out of the studio and then are only broken up later on. So presumably they all are kept there. He doesn't sell them. They're all kept together. But the question is, does Domenico actually share them with any other artists? I think he probably does. He is involved with the Venetian Academy. He's president of the Venetian Academy in the last decades of his life. So it's not hard to imagine that he and Pietro Longhi, who's pretty much an exact contemporary, are kind of comparing notes and laughing at the different takes of the same subjects. But I don't know of any hard evidence that we have of a contemporary looking at these drawings, although perhaps, Catherine, you do?
It wasn't so much I was thinking about hard evidence, but I think it's a really interesting topic, because we talk about the workshop, which sounds like very much a sort of focused place for work, or we talk about the studio as well in a slightly broader way. But in fact, these, the amount of sociability that went on in these places is what we need to remember, and it's not just about teaching, although that's there. With Giambattista's own studio space must have been highly populated. I mean, you have to, you're going to show things to your clients and patrons. They will maybe see drawings as well as oil sketches. You're going to have people dropping in.
Sure.
So even, we were talking this morning in the exhibition, and you, in showing us the run of Annunciation drawings, the Flight into Egypt drawing, for example, about Giambattista making so many iterations on these themes and wondering why. And in a way, of course, it's for his own incredibly sort of fertile imagination to keep trying out new thoughts, but maybe it's also part of having friends and fellow artists, as it were, leafing,
I think that's a really
through.
good point.
And we do know of Giambattista and Francesco Algarotti in the 1740s. I mean, they're experimenting with etching together.
Right.
And we've all, we do have little bits of little snippets about kind of artistic life. I mentioned Anton Maria Zanetti. There's a lovely, in a Marco Ricci letter to Gaburi later, in the 1720s, where Marco is saying that he's been working on etchings in Zanetti's house, and that Giambattista Tiepolo was there and was making corrections on some of them. So you have this idea of the connoisseur and the two artists,
right.
and they're all there.
Canova is trying to buy the Giambattista drawings in the 1790s, eventually buys 4 albums in 1810, but he can only be trying to buy things that he knows exist and that he's had a chance to look at some point previously. So yeah, I mean, there must be visitors to the house, the studio, that look through these, but they're not public works in that sense. We're going to go back to gum Arabic, and then I'll come to the next question.
So an answer to the gum Arabic question is there would have been gum Arabic in all of these inks. It was part of the recipe for making them and enabling them to sort of stick to the paper and to have some viscosity. So as always, these ink recipes they could be anything. I mean, you just don't really know what they are. With scientific analysis, you can sometimes find differences in trace elements, you can find certain additions and other components, but the basic components of iron gall ink do include gum Arabic. I think that corrosion is kind of quite extraordinarily beautiful in its way, and is something that does need a little bit of research. I don't find it distressing in any way, really, in our drawings. I think you really don't see it until you look very, very closely at high magnification. So I kind of love that it's the history of its deterioration in tiny little bits.
A question here in the front.
Thank you. Can you say between father and son, who was your favorite or who was the superior artist?
Bill, why don't you start? Yes. Oh, sorry. Yeah, the good question in the front that no one else heard, asking if we can say which is our favorite of the two artists and possibly which is the superior of the two artists.
Well, the superior I wouldn't dare to say, although a few years ago I gave a talk in Venice on Gian Domenico's series of the Via Crucis. And there's nothing like studying at first hand, as the drawings here show. You find things that you never saw before because you've studied them, and you find things the father never thought of doing.
Yeah.
And as I wrote, that Gian Domenico started to paint narratives when, maybe you know better than I do, but the little bit I've read, just when short stories are being invented in Venice. And I forget the names of the authors. I have 3, and I have not looked into it. I do not know what their small novels look like, read like, but that is something that piques my, I'm not going to work on it, so graduate students, if you're interested in the relationship of literature to the visual arts, I wonder about if he's a modern man, and he was, coming on his own, how did, these circles were so small in Venice, everybody knew everybody. Was there any relationship of the literary arts to the visual arts? And the father never told connected chapters in his art the way the son then did for the next 60 years or so.
Yeah. Anyone else want to touch on the subject of favorite among the family?
Well, as you can probably tell from the slides I showed, I'm a big fan of Domenico and the extraordinary ink washes and layering and sort of complicated construction of these things. So, I just get into the weeds of the little details, and I love it.
It's a wonderful question. It's really hard to answer because because the whole period, as Bill was indicating, there's so much change. So I mean, Venice is a very conservative place, and yet it's extremely cosmopolitan. And what I've always found fascinating is the sort of perceptions that Giambattista was a bit of a throwback, to a kind of Baroque age that's now out of date, whereas Domenico is the kind of upcoming modern man who's looking, But in fact, they're both, they're each combinations of both of those things. And for me, Giambattista is a kind of artist of, if you like, the Enlightenment in the sense of new science, looking to nature, looking to his observation, but using his knowledge of past art, of allegory, using it in a very, very sophisticated and witty way, so that he actually creates the most extraordinary poetry in his, in those great sort of frescoes that create these worlds for us. I'm not sure if that means I'm saying that. I think he paints in poetry, is I suppose what I'm saying. But I think in drawings, they're both poets of different kinds. They both have sort of poetic and expressive feeling that emerges in different ways.
Yeah, I don't mean to stop, because take it from me, but I just want to say that I would like to quote here Martin Gayford, who is an English author and critic, and a great friend of David Hockney, and has written a great deal about Hockney and other British artists, has just published a book on Venice called Venice, the City of Pictures. And I've reviewed it for the Burlington. He's a wonderful writer, but reading through chapter I Don't Know, he says, and I'm almost quoting correctly, because I bring it out in my review, because it stopped me, there are even people in the 21st century who still defend Tiepolo. I'm looking at you, Keith, because you, like me, were defending him. And I stopped and I said, who's accusing him of what? So I just want to say that there are still those people, if Gayford is one of them, who I guess they find fault. And I think, as Catherine said, and as Adriano, nobody has written as beautifully about Tiepolo as Adriano Mariuz, who caught in words the poetry of Giambattista Tiepolo. I think he's the only one who has. So you might look up Mariuz if you want some really extraordinary words on where Giambattista takes us.
Other questions?
Can I
sorry,
have
yes,
some notes?
sorry, Janice.
Yeah, speaking about paintings, I think there's no competition, comparison with Giambattista and Domenico. But speaking about drawings, we find very different interpretations. So, as Bill said, Giambattista thinks always in terms of vision. His drawings are always a chance to image an image, to think about projects and visions for frescoes. And Domenico is a completely different artist and so interesting in so many ways. And the series of drawings are a narrative. Sketches are so originals, is so very different from many other artists in the same time. I should also add some notes about the workshop problem, and I think there are many other artists like such as Francesco Zugno or Giustino Menescardi. We don't know about their drawings. George Knox made some hypotheses, but we actually don't know about their drawings, but they were in the workshops, so they made drawings and probably they copied drawings by Giambattista. So there is a very good avenue of research about this problem. And John, I really appreciate the your proposal of the relationship between Gian Domenico and Giambattista during the 40s, because it's a really new way to look at the relationship between the father and son. So it's very important to pose a new way to look at these drawings.
Right. I mean, I'm fighting an old prejudice, where Giambattista is the great man and Domenico is a sort of interesting but quirky tailing off of the tradition, and I just don't see the relationship as working that way. So trying to correct that.
He says in 43, right, he writes to Germany in French that, and I don't know if he says it because he's surprised, it must be, that Tiepolo's father treats his son as his cher compagnon.
Yeah.
He doesn't treat him as a son, and he doesn't treat him as a student. So in 43, Gian Domenico, in 43, Gian Domenico was what, 13 and 3, 16, 17?
16, 17.
And he treats him as his cher colleague, his dear colleague. So that's kind of amazing.
Well, I mean, you think, where was Giambattista at the same age? He too was an independent master by that age, and Gian Domenico had grown up in the workshop even more. I mean, training from practically the day he was born, so it's not so surprising. Yeah, what could all the copies tell us about the relationship? And it's tricky. I mean, on the one hand, it's a studio practice, and surely Domenico was not the only member of the studio making copies after Giambattista's drawings and after Giambattista's paintings. But it is such a strikingly large body of material. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of drawings in Stuttgart that are documentary drawings. It's really hard to say. I mean, we have the evidence of the drawings. We have no other sources that talk about the relationship or as to why they're done. So what I was trying to do a bit is to give a possible explanation for what these might have meant to Domenico, who was up there. And, in the case of Würzburg, he's up there on the scaffolding, copying giornata by giornata of the frescoes on the ceiling of the staircase. I mean, it's not a casual effort of copying, but literally day by day mapping out the work that was done. It's unlike any other practice I can think of quite to that extent. Manuel.
I don't know the answer to this, but it was interesting that he had the artist starting out in misery and poverty, and then he learned that by the end of his sons, there were 51 properties, 60,000 ducats.
At the end of Giambattista's life, when the.
And here's the question that I can't remember the answer to. Which Tiepolo found his bride at the Hospital della Pietà?
So the question is, which of the Tiepolos found his bride at the Hospital della Pietà?
Which was the musical.
Right. Right.
All I remember are the bands, that when Giambattista wants to marry Cecilia, and
Who is Cecilia Guardi?
Guardi, yes, the sister of the Guardi brothers. This is all I remember. Catherine, or any of you, do you remember this better? That the bands are put up, and isn't there a protest? And he marries her anyway. So, do you remember? Yeah.
Well, Dennis may have more to say about
The Guardi family also was a very poor family. And so Antonio and Francesco were working for the Giovanelli family, just making copies, poor copies from maybe masterpieces in Venice. And Cecilia wasn't very rich, so probably the Tiepolo's family wasn't happy about this
and Tiepolo's
marriage.
own family. I mean, he clearly it's 1719 when.
It should be on.
Yeah. he's marrying in 1719, and that's a time when clearly he's beginning to make a bit of money, but he's been supporting his family because his brothers do have jobs at the Arsenal, his two brothers, but they're not, none of the family has really any money at this point. And I think partly they don't want him to get married. He needs to ask permission to get married, and his family don't want him to marry Cecilia because it means A, they lose him, and B, that's not going to bring in any money. Yeah, more poverty.
Well, and then this saga continues because there's all the business of what goes on. Domenico doesn't really marry until after Lorenzo dies, so he now needs an heir. He marries the much younger Margherita. At the same time, his sister Elena is suing them because she felt she got an unfair share of Dad's estate in her dowry. Eventually, her son is adopted in a way by Domenico and Margherita, but when Domenico dies, there's a secret marriage between Margherita and her nephew who's been living with Domenico and Margherita for 20 years.
Nephew by
so
marriage,
it's a secret marriage, and there's actually like a year. This is all reported in the correspondence between Canova and his agent, and there's a year where the marriage has to be kept secret in deference to Domenico's memory, and then they have a public ceremony a year later, and the whole point of this seems to have been to keep the estate together.
But, okay. I'll tell you why I didn't get the answer I wanted you to. I own a drawing of an interior view of 15 babies and the nurses at the Ospedale della Pietà,
which was a kind of orphanage.
And in the research that I had to do 10 years ago, and learning about Vivaldi being there, and that this was probably the preeminent girls' chorus of Vienna.
Yes.
That Tiepolo was there, went there, and out of those orphans, married one of the girls who was in hospitality.
That doesn't.
Is that wrong?
That's not a story.
It may not be correct.
Don't make it correct. It is possibly, Monroe, a cautionary tale.
Pietro Liberi well predeceased the birth of Giambattista Tiepolo. So why a Pietro Liberi drawing or document should be relating to someone who is not yet born is
He's showing just the scene.
Okay,
I think you've stumped us.
Okay, I'll
it's a good story.
Are there any other questions?
Yes. Hi, I was really interested in the Punchinello figure, and I was wondering if you can enlighten us a bit about why Domenico was so involved in that figure and what significance it had for him. I mean, he was very wealthy, and that seems like a very kind of like peasant humor.
Right. So why does it? So the question is, why does Domenico adopt Punchinello? And I think the simple answer is because Giambattista had already adopted him in the 1730s. There's a body of drawings and a few paintings, and that small painting by Giambattista that's in the exhibition remains in the family house until after Domenico's death. So there is a kind of significance of this Commedia dell'arte clown who's been given a new life by these artists. But as to why they choose to adopt him, I don't have an answer.
It did come to mind this morning when you were talking about this.
Microphone, Bill?
Oh, sorry. It did come to mind to me this morning when you talked about this. I mean, it's such a politically incorrect subject matter these days. Was somebody in the family physically handicapped? But that seems a very strange answer for the wealth of imagination that he brings to it. So
because Punchinello is
I reject my idea, but.
I was only going to say that these figures do turn up earlier in the tradition. There's a huge tradition especially in Tuscany, but not only, also in Rome. I mean, it's part of a bigger caricatural tradition, but you do have the kind of Punchinello type figure, and he's from the Commedia dell'arte, which is in a way street theatre, sort of improvisatory theatre, but it's also theatre that was hugely, I mean, the Medici court, you know, in the 17th century, that's what they love, you know, and the tradition of making, you know, slightly, making humorous drawings, as you say, with characters that seem very earthy. It's there. It's being done at the highest level. You have, you know, you have artists in Rome.
You know,
I mean, you know, there's
there are many
caricatures
drawings
being
of
sent to
Commedia
Cardinal
dell'arte
d'Este
figures
for his personal amusement in, you know, the 1650s. I mean,
But the myth of Punchinello is expanded by first Giambattista, then Domenico, beyond anyone's ever done before. I mean, yes, there's a tradition of Commedia dell'arte. I showed this morning to some of the people as we went through the exhibition a couple of paintings done by Magnasco that also put Punchinello in a kind of family setting. So maybe that's a bit of what gets him started. But there's never any explanation as to why this Commedia dell'arte figure becomes the emblem for the family, the sort of everyman for the family. All we can do is sit back and enjoy the results, I think. Maybe one more question. Julia?
It's a slightly specific one for you, Catherine, but I think other people can weigh in. I've been thinking about that hourglass in the Drawing Academy since you showed it. Are there discussions about timed drawing sessions in the period? Because the only thing I think of is the Concorso Clementino established in 1702, so within a decade or so of that drawing, in which the prova, the test for the painters, is that they get 2 hours to draw a figure posed in the room to prove that they're good enough to have made the paintings that they submit. Is this academy in some way responding to that academic?
I don't think they would necessarily. I mean, well, first of all, maybe, because Antonio Balestra had spent time in Rome and was very much, in fact, entered for the one of the concorsi and won a prize, didn't he, for one of his drawings. So Balestra is somebody who's come from Verona, Venice, and then has this experience in Rome. Meanwhile, the sort of Venetian collegio, I mean, that's been going all the time. Balestra was away, so that's developed its own practices. So it may be that Balestra has imported something from Rome. I think it's also just quite practical. A model physically cannot hold a pose for more than X number of minutes, you know. In fact, you know, I've tried to do life drawing myself, and the way that the teacher ran the class was, okay, guys, you're going to have 5 minutes to do this pose, then we'll do a 10-minute pose, then we'll do a 15-minute pose. So each time you're meant to, you know, work harder at the drawing. But the model, I think 15 minutes is probably the maximum that a model could be expected to, you know. So I was just guessing from the fact that the hourglass is there.
You must be right, but it also, does that then, I think I wanted to push a little bit more. I hope you can help us understand. Does that affect your thinking about time when you look at the drawings, all of the drawings, and the impulse to limit time in some of these works and other ones? Because there is something, you know, with all of them where we see such speed in some of Tiepolo's drawings and such sort of slowness in some of the later Domenico drawings too. I don't know if you wanted to sort of pull us back to that idea in relation to the learning practices.
That's really interesting. I mean, I think, again, we're talking about different types of drawings, aren't we? And in a way, you know, studying the body from the life, you then go away and use the drawings that you've made over short periods of time. You build them up into much more elaborate types of life drawings that are not actually taken from the model but look like life drawings. And that's a much more considered and lengthy process. So in a sense, there's that kind of time. I think with regard to the inventive drawings, I mean, I don't know what people feel, and again, maybe we need artists.
Well, but there is an element of speed in the body of drawings that Ian was talking about,
Yeah,
because unlike all the earlier drawings, he doesn't allow the pen lines to dry before he's in with the wash, and so the wash just blurs all over and, you know, is diffused, and that is a matter of speed as much as anything.
And function, to Catherine's point. I mean, he's thinking visually on paper versus the kind of slow meditative practice of layering washes. There are different kinds of drawings for different ends, and maybe, pardon me? No underdrawing, exactly.
Yeah.
You're just easy
Right.
going as fast
as opposed to many of those others that have that amazingly quick, squirrely black chalk that he then refines with pen and
or
then
disregards and
or
does something
disregards
different.
and redraws in pen.
He's still
Sure.
working very quickly. He's just working with different media as he goes.
But it's an interesting thinking about the speed or the time it would take to produce these drawings is an interesting one. We're almost out of time, so I think I'm going to ask the question that I think we all want to ask, which is, Bill, are you still utterly unconvinced? I gotta ask it. I mean,
Yeah, I figured you would. So I've been thinking about an answer. I think the problem, or the crux, lays in two things. One, after Ian discovered the watermarks, you told me about them, and you touted them as the discovery of the show.
well,
Wait.
Okay.
You asked me a question. I demand to give an answer. That seemed to be a wonderful thing. Then, I started to think about it, because I was brought up both by my parents and by my PhD advisor to be very skeptical about statements like that. Then I went to the exhibition, and I read the wall material. And one of the wall pieces, which you unfortunately gave me a full printout of, so therefore I had it at home to read, said the possibility that he brought this paper home from Germany, blah, 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 there's something in parentheses, further confirms. And I said to my wife, how does the possibility of something further confirm?
is Michael here? Is the editor, our editor here?
Somebody else wrote it. Okay. So my brain starts to churn. Nobody can gainsay the German watermarks. And so I start to look, and I start to think, and I start to read. And I read about all this paper that's moving across Europe, and etc. And that's why they're called Two Cautionary Tales, because it was a long time thinking about the title. I would never say that Ian is wrong. And I would never say that I'm right. But I think that when I look at some of these drawings, and I don't care how those angels, some of them, are not holding clouds, they are like this. And I think Tiepolo's drawings tell us an awful lot. And you don't make a hand like this because there's a cloud. And I repeat what I said earlier, those are two very different kinds of visions. And I think Tiepolo was profoundly sensitive to the meaning and import of pious art. And nothing really moves in the Pietà ceiling. It is a statement of faith. The Scalzi, and we see this in the two oil sketches. One, the Holy House starts on the left, and in the second one in California, it's on the right. So there is this idea that as you look up at the ceiling, that house is moving across the skies. It's an event, believe it or not. And so I find these things keeping me from accepting the thesis as a conclusion. I see it as a thesis, and as I said several times, where do you go from there? How many drawings do you have to look at for watermarks, and until you can arrive at an all but certain conclusion? Until then, I see it as an enticing idea, and I said my last sentence, I am willing to admit my cautionary tale was inoperable, and not today. And maybe it's April and I'm Aries, I'm just a stubborn bastard, that's all I mean.
And unfortunately, there was not time to produce a catalog for this exhibition with the extended argument. So it does get a bit collapsed, and the watermarks, which, as I think Ian showed, were like the last piece of evidence we had, but seemed to confirm what we had already seen with the stylistic shift. But although there's no catalog, the article that Ian has written with this discovery will be coming out in Master Drawings in a few months. So you can hold off on your skepticism and then read this, anyone who wishes, in just a few months. I think with that, we are out of time. I would like to thank our speakers, most of all, for coming. And thank all of you. It's been a long afternoon, and for some of us, a very long day. The show does close on Sunday. Unfortunately, it's already 5 o'clock, so it'll be closed today, but I hope some of you will have a chance to see it again before the end of the weekend. Thank you all for coming.